Hello and welcome to Beyond Extraction, Memory and Revolt featuring Dr. Myriam Dalal. My name is Jamila Ghaddar and I'm very pleased to welcome you and be in conversation today with Dr. Dalal. You are joining us here at the University of Amsterdam, right into our archival activism master's class, in which we discuss many of the difficult, contested, and very important, exciting topics that we're going to be exploring today about the connection between archives and contested histories and colonialism and history. And at the essence, and as we were discussing earlier in our class today, who gets to tell the narratives? Who has the authorial voice? Who gets to decide what is kept or discarded from the past? Who gets to decide whose perspectives and ideas matter and will continue into the future? We did not know, but perhaps we could have anticipated, unfortunately, that when we organized this seminar to discuss with Dr. Dalal the question of guerrilla and public history writing in relation to Lebanon, that it would be during this difficult time of mass genocide and ethnic cleansing in the South, in the Bekaa, and elsewhere in the country. I have so much I should and could say, but given our limited time and given the focus of our discussion today, I will keep my comments brief and will share also that after some brief comments about the current context, I will engage happily with Dr. Dalal in a series of questions around these ideas of how do we broaden or democratize or equalize history, all these difficult terms. One thing that people are often unfamiliar with in terms of the history of Lebanon for various reasons is that the history of Israeli colonialism in Lebanon goes as far back as that in Palestine. And so this aspect of the repetitiveness of history is on our minds, all of us, and certainly has generated a series of Lebanese phrases, which perhaps we'll explore. But the same villages, the same discourses, the same political configurations we're seeing today in Lebanon, the same kind of massacres, the same kind of massive bombardment we have seen before with the founding of the Israeli state in 1948 and in every decade. And subsequently, during the invasion of Lebanon from 1978, it was occupied until 2000, different parts of the country for different periods. And it was liberated through resistance and great sacrifice, as it will be again today. In that context, we cannot truly separate Lebanon's history from that of the struggle against Zionism and the project of so-called Greater Israel, or from the Palestinian struggle for liberation, or from the US imperialist plans for the region, any more than we can separate it from the history of French colonialism that, in collaboration with an elite phalangist collaborators, established Lebanon through a series of violences and partitions and sectarian configurations from 1830 through to the establishment of the Lebanese state by the French in 1920, through to its so-called political independence in 1940s and so on. These are many complicated histories that are grafted onto earlier silences and oppressions of the people that come to constitute the south of the country, the south of Lebanon, that has been the main target of genocide and ethnic cleansing and occupation by the Zionist and US imperialist states in relation to the expansive Zionist project. All of this is news for most of you. You might be very confused as I'm moving through this history very quickly. But at the very least, I want to acknowledge what should be acknowledged and name what should be named. And at the very least, I want to signal to you all the complexities and actors and the dynamics that are part of this conversation. I want to point to the mass displacement of 1 million or 2 million people from their villages and homes in South Lebanon right now, the many massacres, the entire villages leveled like Nakura, gone forever, and the many, many, many martyrs. All of our martyrs from Palestine to Lebanon and beyond. And I would like to ask you to join me in a minute of silence for the martyrs. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. As we go into the conversation with Dr. Dalal, I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Myriam. Hello, Dr. Myriam from Nasawiya, who's part of co-organizing this seminar series, to please share her bio in the chat for everyone. But what I would like to share about Dr. Dalal in my brief time that I've had the pleasure of knowing you, Myriam, so many Myriams, all of them wonderful, is that your work is gesturing at and speaks to so many questions and dilemmas that we can no longer avoid or afford to ignore in Lebanon. And all of it is difficult. And I appreciate the way in which you approach it to try to bring people in, because it's really people who have been left out. One example of that, and I think we might kind of circle back to this a bit more later, is the very term Lebanese Civil War, or very notion of the invasion of 1982. During the period that's referred to as the so-called Lebanese Civil War, it was a period in which half or so of the country was under Israeli occupation, which of course the term invisibilizes. During the period that's called the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, we're only talking about the invasion of Beirut, because already half or so of the country had already been invaded in 1978. So immediately our historical terms point to the marginalization of the south of Lebanon, of half of the country, which from the very beginning of the French intervention in Lebanon was always already meant to be handed over to the Zionists. And so the language already indicates that. And so here we are, Lebanese and Southern as well. So all of this, I read in and through your work in really powerful ways. And finally, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to you to ask you to tell us a little bit about your work, about your projects, and about how some of these issues enter into them. And please take as much time as you'd like.
Thank you so much, Jamila, for the intro into a very big discussion that I'm really looking forward to, but I'm also very afraid because we're navigating this space together. Both of us are Jnubi women. Both of us come from the south of Lebanon. Both of us have a lot of emotional baggage on our backs. And I know, and maybe this is a disclaimer, I know this conversation is going to be emotional, and that's okay. I also know that I am not someone who takes care of their words when they're talking. So if I curse either in Arabic or in any other languages, don't take it personally. This is my way of being into the space and expressing myself in the best and most honest way. I also want to thank Dr. Myriam Karim for creating and co-creating this space for us to speak today, but also for everybody else to learn from our work and through our work how they can be allies and how they can support and how we can continue together working collectively on liberating histories, but also liberating a lot of the things that we were stripped of for the past 80 plus years. So my name is Myriam. I'm a Lebanese woman. I was born to a mom and dad. My dad is from Merjayoun, the south of Lebanon, and my mom is from Zgharta, the north of Lebanon. The first time I saw my village, my actual village, Merjayoun, I was 18 because it was occupied throughout my lifetime in my childhood, and it wasn't until it was liberated in 2000 that my dad was able to buy himself another piece of land and have a house, and to literally he dragged us through the whole process of please come see it at least once, because there was also this disconnect when you grow up, and I think this might connect to everybody who's in this room. When you grow up not knowing your homeland because you're not allowed to go back to it, there's very little that you can do to stay in touch with it. And then I grew up, and first we were living in Bir al-Abd in the Dahi, what they call the Dahi now, the southern suburb of Beirut. And for us, home was like always a place in the middle between my mom's grandparents who were in the north, or like our place in Dahi. And it was always very fluctuating depending on whether or not the Israelis were bombing Dahi. We're talking about the 1996 invasion. We're talking again about 2006. So it was always a back and forth between where is home and how do I connect with it. My work is never objective, and I'm always very careful to say this at the very beginning of every conversation we have within academic circles, because academia always supposes that we need to stay on the on the side of the objective or neutral. My work is always informed by who I am, where I lived, what I learned from living in these spaces, and what I experienced and what I've seen. And this is why we're also talking today about the methodology that speaks on how can we use resistance methods that we've seen with our eyes and that we've known all our lives to try and implement it in our academic but also intellectual thinking processes and methodologies of claiming our histories. I had a background in fine arts, and I had my PhD in sciences of art. And then during that time, I was working on the images remaining from the Civil War period in Lebanon. And it was during that time that I also discovered a practice that is called public history, which is more of a hands-on, how do we talk to people to document their history that has been silenced by official narratives that come from the top-down approach. It was also during that time that I started investing more in using these tools, be it public history, participatory research, action research, artistic research, to have a concrete impact of what it is that we were studying. Because it was always this back and forth between where I am heading at with my research and work, coming back home and seeing how it could be useful, but it's not being used. And it was always at the beginning, it was a dilemma of, oh, how can I make my skills useful for other people who need to have access to it, but also are not part of these elitist circles? And then once I found the ways to link between those, it became a fight, a daily fight for me to try and incorporate these methods and try to make them communicate. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here.
Yes, we have certainly prodded and probed this notion of historical objectivity. It's hard to know sometimes how to approach things. Certainly, if you want to talk about racism or colonialism or Zionism, we have a tremendous amount of empirical evidence of objective. We could talk about the materialist political, we could talk about all of that. But also, what does that really do? Where is the emotion? Where is the lived experience? And so perhaps the question is also, what can actually bridge those divides, if anything, between those who experience that kind of annihilatory violence and those who commit, benefit from, or are complicit in it? And that is profoundly a methodological question. And part of it has been kind of discussed within the discipline of history, which I think is increasingly kind of a porous discipline in many ways, within the framework of public history as well. Here in the class, and we have also suggested to people who registered to read the piece by yourself and Dr. Cavan. So perhaps I can ask you to speak to this question of public history as a method, as a project, and what it provides, or even perhaps its limitations.
Yeah, and it's a good way to start getting the conversation on the track, maybe by also addressing what public history means and is, and how do we use it, and how it is part of an academic field, but also an institutional field, and it has been for the past few years. So very, very basically, public history is a way of making history more public. And there are two streams in which we intervene. There's the publicness of working with people to document their history. And we usually do that. And it's like the primary reason why we practice public history is that a lot of these voices, testimonies, narratives have not been part of the official historical record. So we go back to marginalized voices, silenced, minoritized, and other groups that had so much to say about a certain topic or a period of time. And then we work with them through their own memories, but also their own information about the past to try and make it back into the bigger discussion on history. And then there's the other stream, which is how to make history more public and the output. So once we do the participation and co-production of history with people, we also have to present it to the people in an accessible way. I keep saying this, and I'm gonna have a heart attack if I keep saying this. We need to speak to people with mediums other, and when I say we, it's us academics, in mediums other than publications, in mediums other than books, in mediums other than conference proceedings, because it's their history, it's not yours. If I'm speaking about, I'm going to give a very concrete example. If I'm speaking about the 1996 operation that Israel had on Lebanon, which they called Grapes of Wrath, Anaqid al-Ghadab, I'm speaking about something that affected every single family in every household in a very specific way. Some of us were in the areas that were bombed and had to flee. Some of us were in the villages in which massacres were committed. When I say Qana, everybody in Lebanon connects the name of the village Qana to the massacre Qana. When I say Marwahin, everybody in Lebanon connects the name of the village Marwahin to a massacre called Marwahin. These are not random historical topics. These are things that speak to each of us. Some of us were still kids in schools, and this was a conversation that we've had in between our friends. This is where some of us were on break, because it was also during April and during that time, it was also Easter break. So some of us had to go elsewhere. They were with their families. We watched this on TV. It affected everybody in a different way. For us to make this knowledge available in a book or a publication is for us to disregard everybody whose history this speaks to. And this is why we do public history. So when we do public history, we do exhibitions, but we also do podcasts. We do, we do like street festivals. We do sessions where we just do hakawati. So we sit in a room where other people are there and we just tell a story. It's a lot of mediums because a lot of people speak in different ways and a lot of people connect to the story in different ways. This is what public history is on paper, and it sounds amazing on paper. So you go into the practice of it and you're like, yes, this is what I need to do. I know that a lot of my family, friends, neighbors' history was never acknowledged, and this is why I'm doing it. So I go into it, and then you're in an academic institution. You know the limitations, and this is where we're going to dive into the ugly face of doing such work within the institution. I started seeing this very, very clearly while I was doing the PhD, and it was also related to cultural institutions. And here I'm going to draw the lines between cultural institutions and academic institutions because they share so many things in common. Not the best things, but yeah. When you want to do such work, of course, it's going to be political. Of course, it's going to be vocal. Of course, it's going to make some people angry. Of course, it's going to make some people feel like, oh, this is not the best message. It doesn't show me in the best way. This does not serve the state. This does not serve the funder. This does not serve the general consensus on something. So you're messing. It's like you're going into the beehive and then you're going like this. We have the term in Arabic. So you do this kind of work and you start seeing why it stops and how little you can do. We've seen it also very, very clearly, and it's all like in every way possible since the start of the genocide in Gaza and Palestine and the war in Lebanon. Talks being canceled, university professors being, what do you say? How do you say it? They got fired. And then students getting arrested by police. Book signings no longer existing. Publications no longer taking shape, being retracted. We've seen it in the arts and culture sector, exhibitions being canceled, artists no longer invited to things. And it's showing its face in every way, in the way that any messaging that comes to a point where it becomes not very friendly with the institution or the system, it's not going to go anywhere from there. Money is always tied to a lot of the work that we do. Funding is the way for us to continue doing research, to continue having positions, to continue doing work. So we cannot separate those two, but we need to acknowledge that within these structures, there's very little impact that we can have. At some point, any work that's going to start messing with the consensus of what's acceptable or what's sensitive is going to have to face these questions. Am I going to be allowed to publish this? Am I going to be allowed to have an impact with this work? If I put forward this kind of historical knowledge, and if I claim that I need reparations or that I need to take those people to court for their human rights violations or crimes against humanity that they've done, based on my findings with all the community that testified on this, is this going to be allowed as part of the academic institution or not? This is where public history as a practice comes into facing itself in the mirror. Like, you cannot keep saying that you're doing this work for people if the people want to do something with it and you're not allowed to move forward with it. This also is not disconnected from any other field in the humanities within academic institutions. It's not a conversation that only us public historians need to have. It's a conversation that anyone who's working in the humanities needs to have. What is the academic institution offering me? Where is my limitation? And how much can I claim I'm doing in terms of impact? How honest should I be with the impact that I can have? We keep talking about we as an academic, we keep talking about the infamous buzzword, decolonize this, decolonize that. Everybody wants to do decolonization, and it's in every program, every funding application. So much people are getting so much money to do it, but are we really doing it if we're not bringing back the land to the people, giving them reparations for all the shit that they've been through and the houses that they've lost and the material possessions that they no longer have? Or are we just being commodified by the system to say, see, we're doing something? And I'll give a very simple example. Very recently, Ghana put a bill through the UN system, trying to get a consensus vote on whether or not slavery could be considered the gravest wrongdoing in humanity, which also means that reparations need to be given and other acknowledgements need to be put in place. This decision that was brought up to the UN through Ghana has been vetoed by the US, Israel, and Argentina, but then also all European Union and the UK decided to abstain from voting. But when these countries take such decisions on such a high scale level, how can you, as an academic institution or a person working within these institutions in Europe, in the US, claim that you're doing decolonization work? I mean, your state just voted against it. What is it that you're doing? How much is it? How much can you do? And why do you want to keep claiming to do something that is not on point, that is not going to the root of the thing, that is not serving people in the way that they want to be served? So I'll stop here. We'll take it at the next question of what can we do, maybe later.
You know, funny enough, we were just talking about the UN resolution, Doctora, and speaking to it, you know, also as part of our readings and thinking about the central role of the Netherlands and the Dutch and the slave trade and so on. It's certainly something that I've been learning a lot about as since I came here, and learning how to teach about it as well. And my students have been very patient and kind with me as I went through this process. I think part of the issue is that I've been hearing about decoloniality and decolonization through every massacre in Ghana, through every invasion of Lebanon. I've spent my whole life wondering what people are talking about, right? What was decolon when an entire new conquest in terms of Asia is launched, even well after political decolonization in any number of parts of the world. And so it really refers to this unevenness of the global imperial system. It really indicates different phases and stages and projects taking place in different geographies according to different temporalities as the West seeks global hegemony, which is increasingly becoming difficult for it. And so really it's interesting how in one part of the world, if something perhaps relatively positive happens, it's then globalized. Everything is great everywhere because India is an independent state in 1930 or something. So there's a lot of really complicated questions you're raising. And, you know, I can't help, I can't resist. I tried the first time around, but somehow now I want to go back to Marjayoun for a second. My own family is somewhere between Markaba and Ghaziye, and even the Markaba part is a long erased history that my brother and I had to excavate. Certainly, this is a reality for people who come from those border villages that have been invaded and destroyed relentlessly since 1948 or so. And in that context, these stories and this history, which appear in no history book about Lebanon anywhere I've ever read, but we all have stories of what happened with liberation in 2000. Happy, 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 wonderful stories of reconnecting to our villages. Like the beautiful story you told about your father and how he had to figure out the land, and stories about the first time I could go south of Ghaziye because suddenly the checkpoints were gone. Stories about driving with my cousins and and dancing at all the points where the major battles happened, and coming out to do the dabke, and one of the most erased aspects of history is the liberation of South Lebanon, because it speaks to the ability of people to do something remarkable. Meanwhile, the constant narration of stories of suffering and violence and all the endless visuals from Gaza and elsewhere, and they're recycled and repeated, are meant to demoralize us, right? And so that's part of the conundrum we've been trying to navigate in this course, is that sort of difference between the demonstration of suffering for accountability, but then the way it actually ends up reinscribing those oppressions and violences. And I heard you speak a little bit to that. I can't resist but point out that Netanyahu was in power during Operations Grapes of Wrath, during the first Ghana massacre, and then now he's also committing further Ghana massacres. The people of Ghana certainly remember, but it might be something that the settler population within the Israeli state may have no idea of, in fact. All of which is to say that if the idea of public history is thinking about how people can participate in the writing and dissemination of history, how people can feel that the way history is written reflects their preoccupations and the needs, the urgencies, the issues at stake for them. Maybe you could speak to the limitation of this paradigm that led you to think about guerrilla public history as like that one more step towards realizing those goals.
Yes, thank you. And we'll come back to Marjayoun because I have another very interesting story that connects to the village. So I'm going to give concrete examples of projects that we've been trying to do in the past few years. And for context, I did my PhD in France at the Sorbonne, my first postdoc, in Luxembourg at the University of Luxembourg, and now I'm based at Goldsmith, University of London. The projects that we've been putting together in terms of public history were sometimes local, but also sometimes global. So some of our partnerships have been looking at how to do community archiving and public history in Egypt, in Kenya, in Martinique, in Lebanon, and elsewhere. One of the very specific examples that I could speak at that are basically where the institution comes to its limitation. We were working with a partner in Martinique. And for those of us who don't know, Martinique is still part of the French territories, but it's basically a neo-colony that is in the Caribbean. It's called DOM, Territoire d'Outre-mer. So it's part of France, but also a distant part of France. In Martinique, there's a site where remains of enslaved people are kept there. And this site is under the state's jurisdiction. So the French state still has ownership of how to speak about the site, but also how to make it accessible to people who want to visit. And as you might expect, there's a big discussion on the colonial past of France that is not happening, neither on site nor by the state, nor by the cultural institutions. We were working with a community called the Kakongo community and the Université des Antilles on a project to make visible stories about the site, to make the site more accessible to people, including students from the Université des Antilles, to do some interviews with the people who might have ancestors and like grandfathers and grandmothers who lived in or around the site, and so on and so forth. We knew from the beginning that no matter what the outcome of this collaboration is going to be, the impact of it is going to be limited. Like, we might be able to have students from the university work on doing oral history interviews, which is great. We might do training where students learn how to put up a website where to put the oral history interviews. Great, amazing. We might be able to fund certain technical things that are going to make the site more visible in terms of lighting, in terms of signals and signs put on site, etc. But then there's also what the community wants. And the community wanted to start a discussion on the colonial past of France. The community wanted to start a discussion on how to move beyond thinking of Martinique as a French territory and start thinking about Martinique as a Caribbean entity. And this is not something that we can do. We cannot come back to our funders and say, hey, these guys want to start to talk about whether or not they should be made independent. Like, this is not going to happen. Not in Luxembourg, not in France, not in EU, not in any of those. And you know that your work needs to stop at the point where it goes like, oh, this is very informative. Thank you. Bye. Now you can carry out the work on your own. There's nothing that we can do. Good luck with your ventures. This is where I started thinking of how is it that we can do our work, but also realize how much we can do or not do. You have the funding, and this is a good thing. You know you're in a position of power, so you have communication streams and channels, you have access to resources, you have access to experts, you have access to trainings, and so on and so forth. Good. How can you utilize your position as someone who's based in an institution that can do very little, but that can also allow other things to happen? How can you use this space to be an insurgent, to be someone who takes some of these resources that is made available to you, try and get it out and elsewhere to grassroots initiatives who are actually doing the decolonization work? This community entity that is working with very limited resources, has no access to like big communication channels, doesn't have access to other entities that are working on similar subjects, cannot do in-person meetings because of the funding and how much money they would need to be in a space to talk to other Caribbean practitioners. Can you facilitate that outside of your institution, but then allow this conversation to happen, allow this work to continue? How can you be, and I use this metaphor, which is funny, how can you be the Robin Hood who's taking the money from here, putting it elsewhere where it needs to be for things to actually happen? And how can you also be honest with how much you're doing? I think we first need to acknowledge that the academic institution, no matter how much work it can do, there's also a lot that it can't do. And we need to be clear. I want to stop seeing reports from projects to their funders saying, we did decolonization. No, you didn't. Second, we need to recognize that in our spaces, us being based in these institutions gives us the possibility to be the allies that our partners and comrades and community members need. Three, we have ways to be these kinds who infiltrate the institution, get some of the resources out, and allow this revolutionary resistant work to happen. And these methods didn't come from me. I was not like, I didn't wake up in the morning and think I could do this. I went back to how resistance movements worked in Lebanon and in Palestine. This is where I learned to put the methodology for guerrilla public history. It practically is based on every method that resistance movement used since their inceptions in the Arab world and in Lebanon and in the Levant region. One, they operate in the street, meaning we always need to be close to people to make history accessible in the street and for the people. Two, they operate on limited funding, low cost. And this is what we can allow for the grassroots initiatives to continue. Three, they know when to hide and conceal when there's a very big risk that is targeting them. And this is where also our visibility as an institution is not always serving us to do great work. And this is where grassroots initiatives, when they feel like the state might come after them, they can hide and conceal. And this is another method that we could use. Four, you can have non-combatants be your allies. And this is how you continue funding this resistance movement. Like what we're doing is literally how others manage to fund the resistance movements for years and years. And we can do this. And it doesn't mean that we're claiming something for ourselves. It just means that we're being part of a liberation movement in our position from where we are, but also recognizing that the actual work is happening outside. There's also a very important part that I really want to stress on. Being in academia tries to control your way of feeling angry because they don't want you to move to violence. And they want you to monitor every other population that might move into violence at some point. I've seen so many projects be like, oh, I'm going to do a project where we talk to people to see why they're angry about migration. Like, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to provide this data for the state to understand our anger? Like, if it's not to monitor our anger, I don't know what it is for. And this is also very important in the guerrilla public history method. When we do this work, we need to also recognize that at some point, the communities might decide to take a violent action against 1, 2, 3 for them to claim their own history or to claim their own resources or to claim their own archives. And you're not in a position where you're going to be like the one who's policing the people for the sake of the institution, going like, no, I cannot allow for violence to happen. Oh, I cannot allow for anger to happen. What Fanon said years ago about us using this liberation way of being violent because we've been subjected to violence is something that we need to embrace more in our way of doing work and in our way of doing public history. If I come to someone and tell them, your archive, and I'm very, very specific, I'll give an example later. Your archive has been stolen. It's stored in someone else's house. Sometimes they do exhibitions with it and they claim ownership over it. I want you to tell me the story of this archive and how you came about and how you collected it and what it means to you. But then that's it. That's the end. I am expecting this person who is literally seeing their own possession stolen to not have a reaction against it or like to be tamed in their reaction. And this is wrong. The work that we do, if we want to be empowering or helping people to seek justice, then they might need to do this with their own hands, because none of us is able to actually make a claim and then follow up on it if we are only operating within our systems of how academia functions with, let me do a report on this, let me write a paper on this, let me try and work on this and this. If I want to go to the concrete example that is still something that I'm grappling with, and I don't know what to do, but maybe we can discuss collectively. Karima Aboud is the first female Palestinian photographer. Okay. Karima Aboud is also, by the way, this is where it connects back to Marjayoun, was married to a Lebanese guy from Marjayoun at some point. And she had a boy called Samir. So Karima has made like a huge record of photographs when she was living in Palestine. And these collections were bought by Palestinian people, either pictures of the cities or pictures of themselves, because she had a studio. So people would come up. She used to be in Khiem with her dad, but then they moved back, who was a priest. So Karima had made a lot of photographs, and a lot of people bought it because it was a commercial studio. At some point in life, when the Nakba happened, which is actually being commemorated in 2 days, when the Nakba happened, a lot of people were forced to flee their houses. Their houses were destroyed. Their houses were burned. Their houses were reduced to rubble. When this happened, a person who was a contractor, Buki Boss, walked into these places. Because he's a contractor, he's like, what can I do before I tear this down and start building new buildings? He took the pictures from people's houses that were taken by Karima, and then he collected these. In 2025, there was the biggest retrospective of Karima Aboud's work in Tel Aviv in an Israeli institution and museum. They referred to the person who took these pictures and kept them with him as the collector, a photographic collector. Nobody spoke about provenance. Nobody spoke about who these collections belonged to pre-48. Nobody spoke about reparations and giving back these photographs to the people it belonged to, or to the people that are still connected to Karima Aboud in a way. It was not mentioned anywhere. We talk about museums doing their due diligence in the West, and we're very happy always to like profess about, oh, this is how the museum handles their collections. This is how we repatriate. This is how we do this and that. And then all of a sudden, you have a very concrete example in front of your eyes. Thousands of pictures stolen from homes. Not a single report in the press mentioned that it was stolen. Not a single statement from the curator, from the exhibition, from the museum mentioned that this belonged to Palestinian families. And if I wanted to do a public history project to speak about these collections, do you think I could come to the families whose these photographs belong to and be like, oh, tell me about the picture, where was it, blah, 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 and then stop at that point? Like if they wanted to take back their pictures, how much can I do as an academic, as a practitioner, as someone who's based in an institution? Is it my work to do, or can I facilitate for them to pursue this kind of work? Yeah. There's a very nice documentary that Mahasan Nasruddin has done, and she's a very good friend, Myriam and I know her. Mahasan has done a documentary on the work of Karima Aboud, and also in her PhD, which she defended this year, she spoke about the collector and his background, and maybe exposed a bit of the information that other people wouldn't know. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Myriam, for bringing all these geographies and people and names and Arab women into our conversation. I want to say أهلا وسهلا يا كل جماعة مرجعيون and all of our Lebanese people in the room, all the people from all over the world in the room. And I also want to acknowledge the comment from our sibling from Kashmir. And I express our deep solidarity with the struggle against settler colonialism and Hindu nationalism in Kashmir as well. Of course, the deep connections between the Zionist and Hindu nationalist states are thoroughly documented at both the military, political, and political economy levels. But that perhaps is a discussion for another day. One thing maybe I'll pull up from what you said is provenance, something we think way too much about in this world of my discipline, archival science, and we've certainly discussed it in class and kind of highlight that the way we understand the provenance, as in the history and context and creatorship of a photograph, a collection, or archives, is all about the kind of decisions we make about how we frame things and the knowledge we produce and share. What does it actually do in the world? And that is a question that we're not supposed to ask. It's supposed to be a thoroughly unacademic question, a thoroughly unarchival question, a thoroughly unhistorical question in the context of the Western canon and its methodologies. For me, it's the only question. We discussed a bit earlier an article about the history of enslavement in relation to the Netherlands and how it talks about lateral violence between racialized people as one consequence, one aspect of the legacies of enslavement. And I raised the question, it's a question, it's not a decision. What does it do to talk about these kind of internal violences within racialized communities in front of the white world? And we as Lebanese are caught in that dilemma profoundly every time we think whether or not to talk about the Lebanese Civil War, whether or not to talk about the various ways in which the history of empire and colonialism has created deep fissures and divisions within our communities, our societies, what have you. Well, who gets to decide how these difficult questions are or are not presented? And so we go back to resistance tactics, where you're very careful about what you do or don't say in public, certainly the way I was raised, because you might actually lead to someone dying. You know, the stakes are so high, but they don't look the same for an academic in an institution far from the bombs. Another piece I want to pick up is the question of violence. Of course, who hasn't spent a lot of time reading Fanon late into the night and trying to understand all that he has to offer us in terms of the psychology, the psychological affective impact of the violence on colonized people. And of course, I take your point very well, that always the emphasis is on the violence done by the oppressed, and never that it is a reaction to the violence of the oppressor. There is no doubt we see that in the framing of the genocide in Gaza, of the war on Lebanon, which I consider to be an expansion of that genocide to some degree, but of course not in the same way at this moment. And I think the most important thing maybe for me is that Fanon points out that the question of ending this violence can only happen when the structural inequality and oppression ends. So to keep bringing back to the conversation of how do we end imperialism and Zionism so no one need or not be violent. And I think in that context, why not have that discussion in academia, as you're pointing out, as opposed to just running away from the issue? Well, of course, there are consequences to refusing to not talk about these things, of course. Maybe to bring us maybe back to Lebanon yet all over again and writing the impossible task of writing the history of Lebanon. And I don't want to exceptionalize it, but it is particularly difficult because of how Lebanon was constituted through the collusion of the French Empire and the Ottomans. And I mean, everyone was involved. The Russians were involved. We like to just blame the French, and I'm a big fan of just blaming the French, but it was very complicated. And part of it is like the issue of the archives, if I can go back to this archival activism theme. Who wrote the archives? You know, all these historians, and I, if you don't mind my saying, the Arab bros can be just as guilty of it as anyone, stuck on their records as the objective source of writing history. Because of course we also want to get past all the ways in which history gets instrumentalized, say in terms of sectarianism. I understand. But I'm the person who knows how these archives are created, how these infrastructures were created, the entire history of it since the so-called French Revolution, all of this kind of stuff. And so as part of that, of course, much of the records pertaining to the history of Lebanon are in France. I've whined and complained and ranted and raved about having to go to France to write my dissertation, and how everything just was so difficult to see so much stolen things everywhere. It made me physically ill. And in that context, what do we do when the record's not there, right? And what do we do when the records that's there is just a lie, just a colonial framing? Or when it doesn't even have a single perspective from a single woman from Marjayoun, but gosh, we're going to hear all about what some French general thought about Marjayoun. What do we do? This archival basement that history keeps avoiding, the historian doesn't want to tell us. You know, it's like you have to cite everything except the archival record. When I write, I cite every archival record as if it was literature. At the very least, you could do that. When I write about it, I actually reproduce the archival records visually. And, you know, I did that in my entire work on the history of Constantine Drake, whose collection I was part of archiving. This this refusal to share the archival sources from which history is written, I think is unexcusable at this point in terms of the history discipline. But it's also part of fostering this illusion that there's some kind of objective basis, some kind of something. But it's also a claiming, right? I looked at the records. I have the record. I know what this history is. Who cares about you? Who are you? Like, why do we care about you? So I know I'm like poking and prodding at a million things, but maybe I could, you know, I just want to kind of bring back maybe if it's, or kind of connect us into this question of the archives, the history, the record. And I'm going to do that by giving you one final provocation. Maybe you recall that a bit back when people were negotiating the land demarcation and the sea demarcation between Lebanon and so on. It was France who declared they had a map that settled the question. We don't have the maps. France has the map, and they're doing it right now. When there was a dispute between which is a border between Lebanon and Syria, or where does Syria and Lebanon, France, like, we have the records. You mean you created the map? You made up the map, but also it becomes archival evidence. Over to you, Myriam.
I don't know where to go from there, but I'm so happy that you're so angry at the French. We share the same anger, my friend. Maybe if I can speak a bit more about what can we do when the archives are the way that they are. And I always think with a practical mind because I like to find solutions, and I really believe in the collective. So we were in a discussion / workshop a couple of weeks ago in Nairobi that brought together practitioners from all over Africa to talk about the lessons learned from Africa on how to do community archiving and public participation. And then we had examples from South Africa, Namibia, Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt. Everybody was talking about their own experience of how is it that we were able to construct our own archives outside of the colonial records, or how do we recognize that the colonial records are what they are. There's power in trying to build a community, be it a community in a geographical area, be it a community that has like a shared struggle, or be it a community that shares the same, I don't know, objective. In us thinking that we can construct a community archive that speaks about us from our perspective, there's so much power and so much that we can do to counter everything that's been sitting in the records of the colonial entities. From the decision on what to collect and what to disregard, from the decision on how to name it, how to document it, what kind of words do I use, how do I describe people in my pictures, all of this. And the very system of, oh, you need to follow certain rules to create an archive, otherwise it's just documentation. And we had this question at some point, and we were talking about this. Do we need to create the community archive based on a certain archival structure? Or was it this very archival structure that made us colonized? Like, this was based to serve a colonial message. Do I want to replicate that in my community work? I don't. Going back to Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed and his emancipatory ways of working with the oppressed to attain certain objectives. What is it that we want to construct when we come together as a community and decide we want to work on the history of the south of Lebanon? We want to work on the history of the town of Merkaba. Who are the community members coming into this room? What do they want to achieve with this archive that they're creating? How can we work collectively to make it reach the objective that we want? And how do we make this accessible to generations to come who are going to use our sources to speak about the history? We've been using their sources because we had to. We have room, and we're in a period of, as Professor Noor Niftagudian called it the other day, we are in a second archival turn. We have the chance to start our own records. Our grandparents, some of them are still alive. We can ask them for documentation. Otherwise, let's come together. Let's dig into our family archives. Let's see what hasn't been part of this discussion. A lot of photojournalists in Lebanon have had millions of pictures that were disregarded by international agencies and photographic agencies and international news because they weren't deemed aesthetically pleasing or iconic enough to be published. Can we go back to these Lebanese local photojournalists who for years were called fixers because nobody wanted to recognize them as a photojournalist? Can we come back to them, see what kind of photographs they have, who were rejected, make it part of a community archive that speaks on histories of so many things that happened in the country that were documented by these people? We have a lot of sources. We have a lot of ways to navigate conversations with people who have lived through these periods of time. We can do so much talking to these people. We can come together as communities, and we can create the new archival way of assessing all of this. There's also this concept, and I'm going to come back to the Arab culture and Arab literature. When we talk about, back in the days, when we used to talk about an intellectual that is engaged in liberation struggle or that is engaged in political struggle, we used to call them munadir, okay? Before it became something translated from English and it became an activist, etc. We used to address these kinds of entanglements as a mushtabik, an intellectual mushtabik. I don't have a translation for the word mushtabik, but if you want to know what it is, it's halfway between being entangled in a subject and fighting over it. Us intellectuals need to claim back this position. If you want to be engaged in this discussion, you need to be a mushtabik. You need to stand on the front line, not move, not be afraid of getting physical, down at it. Like this is mushtabik, this is it. And the more we, and Ghassan Abu Sitta, yeah, Ghassan Abu Sitta had a manifesto with a couple other intellectuals from Palestine calling for the comeback of the mushtabik, because we've seen it when Ghassan Kanafani, who was martyred in the 80s, we've seen it how an intellectual who's a writer can also be involved in the political act and the liberation struggle in the fight for liberation. This figure in this concept of being a mushtabik and not an activist needs to come back. And it's a conversation that the word exists in Arabic, it might not exist in other languages. It's also because it was based on the Palestinian struggle, on the struggle for liberation in Lebanon and in the region. Something like a practitioner or a researcher who is within the academic institution doing their work, being critical is one thing, and something like an intellectual who's a mushtabik inside these institutions is a very other type of engagement that should be sustained and should be addressed. And it's a daily fight. You don't have to go big fights. I mean, we've seen it in the past years. You don't have to go find the fight if you're in a Western institution. The fight is going to come to you. You're going to be sitting, and then someone is going to come and provoke you with something. Or a program is going to speak on your history in a very untruthful way. So you're going to have to face it. It's just a will and a power and a decision to be invested in this role.
Thank you for bringing that important treatise in. People are very interested in it. There is an English translation that was also published through Al-Akhbar. I'm just not able to pull it up for you right now. I know we're out of time. Actually, we didn't mean for the event to go on this long, but you asked two Lebanese women to start talking about war and history. This is what you're going to get. That said, I just want to acknowledge the amazing audience we have, these great comments and different input, all very valuable in the chat. I really, really appreciate them. I think to kind of give my closing remark, and then I'm going to hand it right to you, Dalal, to say, Myriam, to say anything you'd like before we're going to just close it on your final word. What I want to amplify and echo from what I hear you say is, what does it mean to center and privilege those on the front lines, those within the besieged cities, those under the bombs, those who are actually making history even as their history is being erased. We are 3 years into this war, from Lebanon and Palestine to Iran and Yemen and beyond. We are well over a century into mass US and Western-driven violence in our region. We forget that over 1.5 million people died in the Iraq wars alone. Let alone if we go back to the 2 million killed in Algeria, or the debate about whether it was 1 million or 2 under French colonialism. There is so much. And in the context of that, so much of our archives have been destroyed, so much of our records. This is happening as we speak in Palestine and Lebanon. And as you know, it's work that I'm deeply involved in trying to deal with and counter and document. And so how do we privilege the people whose struggles allow us to even be alive? Right? And in that context, I hope that you and I can discuss some of the things we are planning to do to write the stories of the grandmothers and to work on the ground to solve some of these issues. Thank you very much, Myriam. Thank you very much, Dr. Myriam Karim, for all your work behind and in front of the scenes to organize this conversation. I found it difficult, to be quite honest, but I am very glad we did it. And over to you, Dr. Dalal, for any closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Jamila. I'm going to first invite everybody who's in the room to check the chat, because Myriam has been doing an amazing job of pulling up the links to the different publications, books, and people that I mentioned, so you're going to see them in the chat. I'm also going to publish everything that we spoke about. There's a paper called Cut the Crap, Reclaiming History Needs a Revolution and Not a Public History Project. That's going to be published in Public Humanities very soon. So you're going to be able to take that piece as is, read it, digest it, practice it, but also share it. The more of us that practice guerrilla public history, the more impact we can do. And I cannot stress this enough. I spoke about the pattern of doing history that is usually based on a tree model, and it's Professor Thomas Covan's history. And I speak about the trees being infiltrated for it to create an ecosystem between the two. There's a fungi model that grows in between the trees. We want to support the fungi models of doing public history. These are the grassroots initiatives that are doing the work on the ground, as Jamila said. And I know a few people who are documenting the erasure of the south of Lebanon as we speak, and I hope some of them are in the chat room today. They're doing amazing work. We just need to be there for them. People are taking pictures and documenting. People are keeping objects of the places that are destroyed. People are speaking about this. It's not that the work doesn't exist. It's just that it needs our support to continue to exist. And we're going to do this. There's a community that's being created in smaller circles that we can be there for them. In Lebanon, in Palestine, and in elsewhere, I called it guerrilla public history because it speaks on the struggles in Latin America. I call it this way, and I connect to the solidarity networks in Africa because we learn from Africa how to liberate ourselves and our archives. I know that the more of us who can do this work in small circles, the more we can have an actual say in what is being told about us and our histories. We're creating our history for tomorrow, but it's being written today, and we need to make sure that it's not erased as it was erased 80 years ago, even though there were so many attempts to preserve it. The archival centers, be it in Lebanon, the Institute for Palestinian Studies, were destroyed and looted in 1982 during the invasion of Beirut. And elsewhere, a lot of Palestinian practitioners and friends can speak about all the destruction of archives that happened in Palestine. I also need to acknowledge that this work has a very big impact and toll on us. And we are doing it with باللحم الحي. We're doing it as much as we can and as long as we can. It's something that we could also think about collectively of how can we come together to support each other. There's been a recent initiative that I started. It's still growing. It's like a baby. It's a network for Arab women in the humanities. It's a network to support the women who are going through all of these conversations in their institutions in academia and in the humanities, but it's also being there for someone who needs an internship and a job, or needs to know how to confront someone who came with them with a very aggressive messaging or tried to suppress them from speaking the truth. We can do a lot more when we are together. And yeah, I'm very moved by today's conversation. Thank you so much for being here.